Yeah, so Lewis, how about maybe like you introduce yourself before you start? Like maybe tell us a bit about yourself, your study, your YouTube channel.
Yeah, absolutely. So my name's Lewis Howarth. I am a PhD student studying ethics at university. I focus primarily on veganism and defending it via a Hegelian dialectic or hermeneutic. And yeah, I would argue that veganism is a moral obligation. And so I made a YouTube channel to educate people on why veganism is a moral obligation, also spread the messages of other ethical obligations like socialism and yeah, just philosophy as a whole. And you can check that out at Perspective Philosophy on YouTube. So yeah, I hope that explains who I am.
Yeah, I'll leave those links in chat for anyone who's interested. Just give me a second. Yep, so those are the links to his YouTube channel and also his Discord server. Cool. And while I'm at it, I'll just leave Adrienne Wallace's Twitter. Cool, all right, so would you like to begin?
Yeah, so I can, yeah. So my name's Adrienne, and look, thank you very much to Maya as well for inviting me and for the Vegan Society for having me. This is a question I kind of took up years ago, and I suppose just the busyness of politics, I haven't actually come back to it until now, so I'm delighted to kind of have that impetus to get stuck into it. So I'm a counsellor for People for Profit in Carlow, the heart of Leinster, the real capital, as we say down here. But I'm also a member of the Socialist Worker Network, which would be a sort of revolutionary Marxist tradition as well, and we're a network that operates within People for Profit. So what I'm going to try, and look, give me, look, if I'm going on too long, I didn't time this, I never do, so just give me a 5-minute warning and then I'll wrap up. Give me 5 minutes and then 1 minute and I'll wrap up, but it shouldn't be too long, hopefully. I say that. We'll see. So the way I've structured this is kind of to talk about, like, will veganism in itself as a movement save the planet? Then kind of what I want to make, I suppose, is the argument that capitalism is the problem here, and it's not, you know, sometimes you do hear it's not overpopulation, or it's not humans nature per se that is inherently bad, and that's the problem. I want to focus our energy on capitalism. Then I kind of want to talk about Marx on nature, Marxism, I suppose, and all the Marxist revolutionaries throughout kind of history and currently their position on nature, and then on animal rights, I suppose. And I want to kind of bring forward the question. So it's kind of two things here as well. I think, I suppose, the left across the world have really seen an upsurge, thankfully, in recent times, and I think particularly in Ireland, it's fantastic. We're really in good shape here, and I suppose the question now is for future generations, like, is there room for animal rights in Marxism? And not just, I mean, I brought forward this paper, or a version of this paper anyway, to a conference, the Essenment conference. We adopted a position in opposition to factory farming. And a huge amount of, like, I mean, every socialist I know has a big care for animal welfare and you know, obviously the environment, and we're definitely an equal socialist organisation. But the question now is, what about animal rights? Like, the right in itself, and we're not just eating or eating ethically, but, you know, so it's just a question. I don't have all the answers, but I do think there is room for it in Marxism. I'd love to see a kind of new generation, or even yourselves as the Vegan Society, interact with these questions and kind of bring it to the left, and let's try and make this a mass movement that has the power to really transform society and bring animals with us, not just workers and not just saving the environment. So no easy task in itself, for sure. So I just think it's, I suppose, what we're kind of seeing here with COVID is the fragility of humanity. Really, we kind of had this assumed position as an Earth's dominant species, but that we have kind of effectively been shut down because of this virus. And while we kind of grapple with this, the far deadlier beast of climatic catastrophe is growing ever closer and at such a menacing pace as well. And kind of despite our specific knowledge and the technological prowess that we have, one thing remains very clear, is that we're not the masters over nature, and that we are a part of it. So the idea that we can view ourselves and our economy as something that exists independently of the natural world could be the end of it. So it's about creating, I suppose, an economic and a political system that doesn't put the environment on the back front, doesn't push workers' rights on the back front, but actually sees that as a part of it. So the focus isn't all on GDPR, but it's on, I suppose, environmental, it's on wellness, it's on all the different things that are currently missing. And so I suppose the question I kind of want to pose to people is, you know, will veganism in itself, and I'm a vegetarian and have been for years, and, you know, I'm curious as well, I suppose, for people, I kind of dug this into in two aspects: one, animal rights, but also the environment, because I know a lot of people have chosen to become vegans because of obviously the reducing their carbon footprint, and it's definitely a move in the right direction, something I'm advocating for on that basis alone. But is it enough in ourselves, I suppose, to tackle climate change, or do we have a production issue? Like we see, you know, we all are very, very much well aware of how damaging factory farming is. It's a massively negative effect on the environment, extremely exploitative of workers, and we've seen this with the meat factories here in Ireland during COVID, who are blatantly disregarding the COVID restrictions and kind of bringing in a lot of mostly migrant workers because they're a lot easier to exploit. They're very hard to unionize, and it's very easy to put the fear of God into them. Puts them in very unsafe conditions. Hot bedding is one example of this, where they have to kind of share beds. And we've seen that it actually has put this country down on lockdown. And the government's response to this meat industry was, instead, if you remember, it actually chose to shut down Laois and Kildare and somewhere else. I think this is in the second lockdown, instead of actually regulating the meat industry. So you can see there's a very close relationship already between the establishment politicians and the beef barons like Larry Goodman and all these guys. So they exploit the workers, and they're allowed to get away with it. They exploit the small farmers who are literally in poverty. A huge amount of, I think 1/3 of all small farms are actually not viable as it stands. And then at the centre of this as well, you see that factory farms are a centre of magnitude abuse of animals in terms of the living conditions that they're forced into, and the fact that they're just treated like pieces of meat and not living beings that have, you know, social hierarchy and a culture in themselves, as so many studies have started to reveal. So if we were to convince the world in the morning to be vegans or to be vegetarians, is that enough? And I think then how do we raise the question of animal rights within all this? So I just want to talk about production under capitalism. So, and here now it's kind of how we produce revolves around why we produce as well. And the question at the profit is the question at the source of this is profit, and everything else becomes secondary. So whether that's environmental regulation or workers' rights, as I kind of touched on already. And so you see, capitalist agriculture kind of leads to disjointed zones of homogeneity, like vast landscapes of monocultures such as palm oil plantations, or kind of giant barns of almost identical animals. Now Ireland doesn't have I suppose, definitely in America you have that meat, the high intensity meat industry. In Ireland, I suppose, where we have, more land, and it does apply kind of across the world over. And that you say these zones are kind of artificially separated from each other and the natural cycles under which these kind of organisms and animals evolved in the first place. And this is all manner of negative consequences, not least the extraordinary cruelty that is done to animals in here. But one that is particularly noteworthy and relevant today is that it actually allows for viruses and pathogens to kind of spread a lot quicker, because like while deadly viruses obviously exist in nature, their spread is often contained by kind of various natural buffers. But what we've done with this monoculture type of farming is removed these natural barriers, and we've seen, you know, the swine flu is one example, Ebola is another, as things as those barriers are removed to produce in this capacity or in this way. And I think as well, the question is, and we've seen a huge sort of turn up in almond milk, and a lot of vegans, we probably all consume that as well. But if you look at the almond industry actually in the US, what they've done is completely killed off the natural bee population. And so they actually get big massive trucks now of bees, of live bee colonies, and they ship them into these almond farms. And then what's happening is that these bee colonies are actually dying because the pesticides that they've already used on these massive almond farms are killing off the bees. Like, for me, it's a very capitalist solution to a very capitalist problem. And it brings into the question, though, although obviously we've removed, I suppose, a big part of our carbon footprint by taking out meat, and we are addressing, I suppose, and it is a protest, definitely it's a protest not to consume meat. We still see that the problem of production exists in every avenue. Even when we choose more ethically and better kind of produce, we do see that it's having that detrimental effect on the environment nonetheless. So yeah, sorry, I said that already. So I think Marx's contribution to all of this was that he connects the kind of distribution not simply with human activity, but with the way, you know, capitalism organizes this activity. And I think that takes up the question of whether humans are bad or essentially bad. And humans have always kind of lived in relative harmony with the environment, but that's not to say that we didn't drive some species to extinction. Even if you look back, our ancestors, the Homo sapien, you know, they did kill off the woolly mammoth. But the difference is that we would have taken up the role the woolly mammoth played in that environment, in terms of we kind of started to farm around that period as well. So we would have, you know, kind of curated or kind of controlled a lot of the natural environment that the woolly mammoth would have been doing in its grazing and so on and so forth. So I think that for me anyway, humans have always had an effect, and it hasn't always been the most positive effect, but it wasn't one that brought us to the brink of extinction as capitalism is doing today. And this is despite capitalism, really, if you look back in the history of humanity, it's one of the most like dynamic systems really that evolves. It's brought to fruition massive technological discoveries, huge amounts of art and culture and all that. But the downside of that is that, and actually I suppose the reality is that I think it's kind of filled its purpose really, and that it's created an unstable system now that is filled with contradictions. So although we have all these great things, we don't have control over them as a species, as a society, and it's actually in the controls of private interests, and that's where the damage is really kind of being done. I'll try not to go into too much long. I'm about kind of retarded about you. So despite its kind of immense productive capabilities and the tremendous scientific and cultural development, capitalism has led to poverty, war, and environmental destruction on an extraordinary scale. And you really see that famine and famine and want will coexist with abundance. And even if you saw, I think at the start of this, there was an issue with the market, the dairy markets, and you saw huge amounts of farmers actually just dumping milk, dumping it because it didn't tie itself well enough into the market, and you'd flood the market. So you actually see that human production is like this abstract gambling system, like of Wall Street, of these figures that doesn't satiate human need, and actually just kind of really ties us to a very unstable system of whether or not the rich stay rich. And I think that's where the question really, why it lies for me, why it always kind of repel vegans to take up that fight against capitalism as well, not just for the animals but also for the environment. So I think it comes down to, I suppose, a few issues then, particularly within capitalism, that workers have no say in what we produce or how it's used. And as I said, it's kind of directed by private interests in a relentless competition for profits. So we have no publicly controlled or rational distribution system. And to take this down onto a micro and a local scale, if you look at how the public health system is being run in this country, not very well, and it hasn't been very well for a long, long time. Instead of having a middle management of the HSE on inflated wages, making decisions, the resources should be with the nurses, with the people who are actually on the ground and have the expertise, and they can decide where they go. That, I think, would actually do away with a lot of the red tape and a lot of the waste. So let's expand that into every sort of corner in society, and not just nurses or anything like that. And you kind of see as well that an individualistic capitalist firm has to stay in profit, so it has to keep costs down. It has to constantly outdo its competitors. And you see this kind of system of expands, disrupts, extracts, exploits, endlessly commodifying every aspect of our lives, but we're going nowhere quickly. We're almost stumped in and caught in this cycle. And even I always kind of say, let's say the CEO of Shell gets a conscience in the morning and suddenly decides he doesn't want to keep digging for oil anymore, and he's going to put his money into renewable energy. But what he's going to do there is take himself out of the game. So even if he wants to perhaps use, he doesn't want to go into renewable energy. What he wants to do is start investing in this equipment or in this machinery that will ultimately is better for the environment, but it costs more money. Even if he wanted to do that, that means then he would actually start to lose profits, and one of the other big competitors, BPI, would just gobble him up. So the system doesn't even allow for a sort of consciousness in terms of how we want to use our resources very well. So very quickly then, to kind of understand this on the ecological consequences of this, there's 2 points that are crucial. The first is that the intensity of capitalist competition means that the system operates on short-term cycles. Firms that cannot maintain this go under. And any potential then for long-term planning is severely constrained because you need speedy returns on investment. So it's always this short-term grab, and instead of kind of planning for the future and looking at the environment actually not just as a means to an end, but something that we need to protect and we need to ensure its survival along with ours. And we recognise this perhaps existential fear, but the capitalist class absolutely do not. And I thought it was very good. If you notice how Texas there in the middle of a blizzard, it was actually how Ted Cruz responded by going off on holidays to Cancun until he got caught. But that's how the rich will respond to this crisis. They will be the least affected. Eventually will come for them, but they operate on an ideology and a rationale that's very short-term focused. So they're not looking at the long-term picture, whereas we're already starting to see the effects of that. So Engels actually comments on this. Frederick Engels was Marx's collaborator over 100 years ago. And what he says is kind of, what cared the Spanish planters in Cuba who burned down forests on the slopes of mountains and obtained from the ashes sufficient fertilizer for one generation of highly profitable coffee trees? What cared they that the heavy tropical rainfall washed away the unprotected stratum of the soil, leaving behind only bare rock? Again, this was 100 years ago, and he's noting this short-term effect for profit. Now, if you actually compare this today to how the Amazon was burnt down in response to the Mercosur deal that Ireland had signed up to, which is obviously going to flood the Irish market with Brazilian beef because it's cheaper. So, you know, we're still seeing that effects and that ideology happening here. Now, the second point then of the ecological consequences of this system is growth. While the need for a kind of planned, efficient, free public transport system is obvious, like we're all very aware we need to stop using cars, we're actually seeing automobiles continue to push ever more kind of vehicles. And I actually see this the whole time in the council. It really annoys me, their environmental response. It's very much individualistic. Let's just encourage people to make a few changes and they should all go electric. And I was like, but how are these electric cars going to be manufactured in factories that rely on fossil fuels? You know, how is the electricity currently manufactured? Fossil fuels. So we're kind of beating around the bush here. But again, it's to increase sales, and all manner of products then are created under this. And you have the inbuilt obsolescence that is essential to capitalism, where we have kind of your products like your washing machine and your fridges and all that, where they actually have, and cars even, I think, as well, have that sort of inbuilt obsolescence that they're designed to break eventually. So you have to keep producing, or you have to keep buying and consuming. So look, I kind of leave most there. I hope I've kind of gotten that across as well. And I suppose one thing I just do think is important to criticise is how carbon tax is falling short. And it's ultimately a kind of failure of the Greens to take up this mantra of only individual change is going to do everything, and penalising poor people, which is what the carbon tax will do, is the way forward. The most environmentally friendly option should be the cheapest. The Greens have not done that, and the government have not done that. And as a result of that, you're going to see this continuous issue anyway, because people aren't going to be able to afford to be environmentally friendly. But the fact is that the carbon tax actually falls short in countries where it has already been introduced. I think Norway, Sweden, it hasn't actually, or marginally only, reduced the carbon footprint. And that's not even to get into the economics, I suppose, and the moral issue of penalising working class people for a problem we did not create. But it is taking up the issue that it's a kind of smoke and mirror response, really. It makes it look like they're doing something, but it won't be enough to address the issue. And I think this is why we kind of have to mount a collective challenge to the system as it stands. And although veganism is like that step in the right direction, it's about organising that, I suppose, into a political argument as well to kind of push back the system and defend that planet and kind of move forward in that ilk. So I just want to kind of say a little bit on, I'm going to just read a quote here from Rosa Luxemburg, who I love. Just a brilliant woman if you ever have the time to read her. Really confident. She was but she was a Jewish woman. She had a bit of a disability, and she was just so fiery. Like, I mean, 100 years ago, she's like, I'm going to lead this revolution, and she did for a while anyway. But this is just what I want to kind of highlight to the Marxists in the room, or to the people who are interested in Marxism. That, you know, there is space within Marxist theory for, I suppose, animal rights. So here now, this is Rosa Luxemburg. She's actually in prison for like the 10th time in her short life already. You know, her comrades have been blown to bits, and she's isolated and cut off from everyone. And what she notices is the prison guards are bringing in water buffalo. So she says, they come from Romania, the spoils of war. The soldiers who serve as drivers of these supply wagons tell the story that it was a lot of trouble to catch these wild animals, and even more difficult to put them to work as draft animals because they were accustomed to their freedom. They had to be beaten terribly before they grasped the concept that they had lost the war, and that the motto now applying to them was woe unto the vanquished. The hide of a buffalo is proverbial for its toughness and thickness, but this tough skin had been broken. During the unloading, all the animals stood there, quite still, exhausted, and the one that was bleeding kept staring into the empty space in front of him. I saw before it, and the beast looked at me. Tears were running down my face. They were his tears. And I just find it kind of remarkable in that, like, you know, that really humanistic strain within Marxism, and how I suppose that urge for freedom, and how these animals that had been wild and were living at peace in nature, and yet the brutality of the capitalist system really beat them and kind of, you know, made them subservient really to the will of the system. I think as well, like, I mean, we have to look at, like, even Marx and Engels, they didn't say, like, you know, that everything we say here is absolute. Like, there's some very good ideas and analysis, and we're probably one of the first. I'm sure many of us have come to the same analysis in our own life, but Marx was probably one of the first to put down in paper and popularize it in such a way. But even Engels kind of says that the whole of human history is and how ridiculous it would be to ascribe any absolute validity to our present views. So kind of saying, I know some stuff, I don't know everything. And that kind of again brings the question of our generation looking at the question of animal rights and Marxism and trying to intertwine the two. And like, you know, the sort of Marxist principle as well, from each according to his abilities to each according to his needs. I don't see why there's any reason why that can't be extended to animals. And I actually think we perhaps are looking at our relationship with animals as they are our pets, and they always were the owners. They work and they do this first. Well, I actually kind of see that this is a different type of relationship, perhaps a use-value relationship, which Marx kind of speaks about a lot. And I think it's although an animal like a horse in a yard might do, pull the plow, not anymore, but whatever animals kind of do in the farmyard. I'm not a farmer myself, but the thing is, we provide them with shelter and food. So for them, it's not like they're these dumb big louts that we've beaten into subservience. They're actually gaining something from this relationship too. And I think it's about kind of looking at that social relationship in the system and kind of seeing that, you know, there's a bit more quality to it rather than just seeing ourselves as that dominant species. They're actually gaining something from this as well. And is that not a kind of a different exchange that we have to acknowledge? Marx himself, when he kind of speaks to animals, and this is what I kind of like him, so he was a materialist, so you couldn't talk about consciousness per se, and he even kind of say that, you know, he does note that the difference between humans and I suppose non-human animals is that, you know, we have a dialectic relationship with the world, and that, you know, it provides sustenance with us, but that we also change the world, and in that process it changes us, but animals don't necessarily have that. And I think that's a fair enough analysis. You know, animals don't build skyscrapers, you know, and I don't mean that, but that doesn't necessarily mean or justify their subjugation or their continued subjugation in a socialist world. And I think what has actually kind of happened is, as Gramsci said, is that the dominant ideology is the ideology of the dominant class. And that when we look at the non-human animal as merely an end to our means, we take on the role of oppressors. So my question is to the socialists in the room, do we want that in a socialist world in the future? Like, are we seeing animals serve their purpose in terms of we get to eat the meat off their bones? So, like, I mean, should we really be analysing that question in a bit more detail? How justified is that? And what do we do kind of bringing it forward? And I think there's a very interesting, actually, it's only a footnote, but it appears in Capital Volume 1, and it's where Marx kind of reports on an observation he made on a farm. So there's another, I think it's a German socialist, Susan Wichdahl, and she kind of remarks, what Marx finds remarkable is the difference the way the humans treated animals when they were serfs and the way they treat them as doubly free wage labourers. As serfs, they viewed animals as fellow sufferers, which, like them, were utilised as means of production and therefore endured the same mode of exploitation. When they moved up a rung and became wage labourers, they began to beat and abuse the animals. So they were now told that they were free human beings, even though they actually remained unfree and were exploited in a different manner. And I think this is a very interesting observation in two ways. Firstly, it's that the serf, the social modes of production, have ensured that the animal and the serf are in an equal relationship, albeit equally repressed, but it's equal nonetheless. And the serf's response is to treat the non-human animal as an equal, perhaps in an expression of solidarity with their shared plight. But when the social relation changes, we see the wage slave consumes the dominant ideology, that there is such a thing as a tormentable body that is deserving of exploiting, and our interaction with the animal changes. So the social mode of production changes, the non-animal human has stayed the same. So the substructure has shifted, but the wage slave needs to justify his new position, and consequently he kind of begins to degrade the animal. So, you know, we begin to treat animals badly because we are forced into an exploitative relationship with them, and not because it's natural or normal to do so. And something I notice, and you see it kind of, Marx will talk about how the body is reified under capitalism, you know, that, you know, workers aren't workers, we're not human beings per se, with needs and wants and expressions, but we are, like, you know, that expression, all hands on deck, or, you know, you become a sort of part of the cog in the machine. And that, what I kind of think is that definitely happens meat as well, like in terms of it's packaged to us. We get our little our hamburgers in little plastic trays. Every bit of meat is that, and that becomes reified from itself, and that's decades of the meat industry. Again, though, are we consuming this dominant ideology? And something I noticed is that when I became vegetarian, and I did this, I became vegetarian just kind of to our course in college, in Carlow College here, just opened my eyes to it. And there was a great book, J.M. Coates' The Lives of Animals, that just hit the nail on the head for me. It got through to me, kind of. But I noticed is that, like, going around, you know the way you see your burger advertised, or a picture of your burger advertised, I could see the rest of the animal, like, not, you know, physically materialized, but I started to see that's not just a piece of meat, that's actually a part of a living being. And that kind of process of reification was overturned to a degree for me anyway. So again, just kind of coming back to this point, this is decades of the meat industry peddling their propaganda about what meat is, and have we consumed that idea alongside our steaks. So essentially, kind of capital has thwarted our perspective on animals and created, like, from life to livestock, and that's a language that we use quite commonly, and it's not challenged as well. So, and I'm nearly finished here now. So, and I think as well is that for Marx, he kind of recognizes, you know, what defines human beings or whatever, and he sees it as through our social relationships. But we're seeing more time and time again how intricate and delicate and complex animal social worlds are. Even cows, like, there's a popular cow in the field, and if that cow is removed, somebody else will kind of take her place. As much as in any room we go to, there might be a louder person who draws a bit more attention, and then somebody else might take up that position. You know, animals in terms of dogs as well, we're seeing, and I think as well, just to kind of add on to this as well, is the question of evolution. Just because kind of animals haven't just now created the means to build skyscrapers doesn't mean they can't. And we're seeing that there's in some parts of the rainforest, there are gorillas or family rapes or something, and that they're teaching tool use to their young. Now that same family are actually that same species are being threatened by the palm oil industry. So there's a lot of questions to ask about if capitalism hadn't had such a negative effect on animals and their habitats over the long run, what type of life would there be? And in socialist world, which I hope is around the corner, rather than, you know, the barbarism Rosa Luxemburg warned us about. But that, I mean, the potential is there. We know that because we evolved from this planet too. So the potential is there for animals to do that, so they can take up this role. And I think just because we're a little bit ahead of the game does not mean that we should be the oppressors of them as well. So, in conclusion, I think that we need a people power movement, and we don't need, it's not just about legislation from above to save the planet and to fight for animal rights. I think if you look, Reid Smith, or PBPTD, had a fantastic bill in the Dáil on keep it in the ground, keep all current, stop the exploration of oil and gas, and that went through. It was actually passed in the Dáil. And let me tell you now, they found every bureaucratic measure to not actually make it worth the paper it was put on. This system is designed to not be progressive. It pays lip service sometimes, but it's definitely not going to win us the fight against climate change. So that is why we need a people power movement. And what I'd always kind of say to people is, like, get involved with people before profit. Never has a generation before actually had to deal with the fight that we have on our hands. It's terrifying at times. And I found a real sort of tonic to that is kind of seeing the collective power of my comrades all across this country. Look at the repeal movement, and this is just something Marx kind of touches on. I'll finish now, but he does kind of say how we're alienated as well from our labour, and in that alienated from nature and the metabolic rift, which I think it's too much detail on. But I noticed something that, and Moya was a fantastic cheerleader really of the repeal movement here. I mean, she was there from day one and did a fantastic job. So just kudos for her as well. In Kildare or in Kilkenny, where it's a little bit harder to get those arguments across at the start. But that, like, so I worked in bar work before I became a counsellor. So you're like literally stuck in a bar, yay high. You're there for 8 hours. You're told what to wear, when you can eat, when you go to the toilet. I mean, that although like my labour became something that was used to exploit me to get my bosses very, very rich, and it's something you almost kind of resent. But I really noticed this is that through the repeal campaign, that collective energy, that collective labour actually changed the country. And I had this very, very weird sensation afterwards where I felt like it only kind of dawned on me what it was, because I remember hearing a reference to someone saying the same thing kind of during the Russian Revolution when workers kind of took back the power and really kind of changed the course of history for a short period. But it was like everything looked structurally the same, but felt different. And I just said, what is it? I just thought maybe it was exhausted, probably been hungover. Kind of after I kind of delved on it a little bit, the world was the same, but how I interact with the world changed, and that my labour stopped being something that was used to exploit me and became this magnificent forebringer of change alongside, and the fact that it was collective. And that's one thing I will say about the vegans in the world, is that we need that collective force, and we need people definitely to make the arguments for animal rights within Marxism, within socialism, on the basis that animals deserve rights, not just because it's good for the environment, although definitely worth right, but and at the same time we need to tackle the question of production and kind of move in a more sustainable system. So we all know what's going on, and we're lucky that we're in a position to have this information and this knowledge. And I just think that if we don't work together, if we don't challenge this system, we all know it's a very, very scary and dark road ahead for all of us. So I'd always encourage people to get involved in People for Profit, join the local Trinity branch. They're always a great group, and really kind of fight for change, because we're probably the last generation that will have this chance. So I will leave it there, and thank you very much. And obviously any questions afterwards.
Wow, great, thank you very much for that talk. So all right, I imagine we'll leave the questions to the end. So cool, Lewis, would you like to go now?
Yeah, happily. Thank you very much for that riveting talk. I actually really enjoyed it. I think there was some very interesting stuff said there, like the reference to Rosa Luxemburg, who is actually great, and you know, some Gramsci and Gramsci. I always say his name wrong. There's some really interesting philosophy that was talked about there, so I appreciate that. And hopefully by the end of this, I'll convince you to move away from vegetarianism and to full-blown veganism. So that's the goal for this. So essentially, I think that the best place to start with all of this is 70 billion animals are killed every year for the use of humans. And at the same time, 4.2 billion people on this planet live below the UN poverty line, which means they cannot afford adequate living or nutrition for life expectancy. Why is this happening? Well, I think the cause is common. I don't think that it's separate. I think that it's actually the exact same thing happening in two separate mechanisms within our society. I think that there is two forms of ideology that are permanent or permeating the way in which we behave. The first one is capitalism, and the second one is carnism. Capitalism being the dominant ideology of the exploitation of the worker and the consumer, and carnism being the dominant ideology of animal consumption and exploitation. So when we engage in this political analysis and we see that there are so many individuals being harmed, what we need to consider is what we can do, what we should do, and then move on to what we will do. So the first thing I think that we need to analyze is why this is happening and what these two ideologies share. These ideologies share, I think, and I would argue, an exploitative relationship with the other. And I use the other in terms of the big other, your relationship or your relationship dynamic with another individual, another being who has an experience of pain and pleasure outside of your own. Humans in capitalism are split into employees and employers, whilst animals are made into products or objects. Both are divorced from the metaphysical reality from which they instantiates their being. Both beings contain within them pain and pleasure, which demands to be considered within an ethical relationship or an ethical dynamic, and then from that point in how we politically engage with one another. The reality of the situation is we live in a master-slave dynamic with both humans and with animals. In case of humans, it's the employee who is the slave. In the case of animals, it's the animal, and the human is the master. And so what we can see is an intersection between two forms of ideology which have created a power dynamic in which even the oppressed humans in our society continue and use the value that they are given in respect to their wages, unjustifiably stolen from them, is then used to purchase products from a capitalist class who then exploit animals. One thing that we need to consider before we get into any of the real life consequences is why any of this is happening and why this dominant ideology is being perpetuated through our society. I think the reality is that it always has been, that the exploitation of others has been a constant feature within society from society. Throughout history, we have seen the perpetuation of ideologies onto itself, which treats others as being lesser. I think if we look back far enough, it gets worse. So if we go back to, as lords and serfs, I'd rather be a worker than a serf. If I go back further again, we look at masters and slaves. I'd rather be a serf than a slave. And if we go back even further, then we have tribalism, and until we hit the point of the state of nature, if it ever existed. The reality of the situation is that we are seeing a metaphysically developing process of understanding otherness and the consideration of the subjectivity of others in our actions on an ever-increasing basis. The next step is the consideration of animals. We've already hit the point of anthropocentric morality. We already know that capitalism is bad for humans, at least most of us do. But many of us don't realize that animals even matter in the first place, just as many people didn't realize that the serfdom was exploitation, and how many people still don't realize that worker exploitation is as bad as it is. So what needs to be instantiated first is why it's bad to have an employee versus an employer relationship. I would like to harken back from Marx, which the last speaker was talking about, and bring it back to Hegel. Hegel, before Marx, was one of the instantiators of the dialectical view of history. And he argued that there was a master-slave dynamic, which showed the contentions in ideology that progress through society. The master is those who assert a given proposition in terms of ethics. They assert something to be good. The slave is the individual who performs the action they are told to perform or agrees with the master. In this case, you see that there is an unjustifiable claim, that the assertion of one class of individuals supersedes the assertions of another. This is being slowly remedied for Hegel and for Marx, and I think that's something that we are remedying today when we question the dominant ideologies of our society, namely capitalism and carnism. Both are based around this unjustifiable assertion that one class is worth more than another, that one being's interests is worth more than another. Why is it that the pain of one individual, or the pleasure of one individual, or the wealth of one individual is considered more than that of another? Why is a worker, in terms of an employee, considered less valuable than a CEO who, as an employer, may do less work, who may produce less value, who may not actually instantiate a greater market position in terms of the value they produce than that employee? The owner of McDonald's does not produce thousands of times more than the checkout worker. They are just given an unjustifiable position within the market, and it's instantiated through pseudoscience, through a managerial science which shows that they alone are the ones that are capable of producing this value, when there's no such evidence to instantiate that claim. And even if there was, they would still be reliant upon those labor hours. Don't know what happened there. Okay. They would still be reliant upon those labor hours of those individuals who are their employees. And so the value they produce is actually a capturing of the surplus value produced by those who work beneath them. In terms of animal agriculture, Humans buy animals. Humans buy animals as objects. They are treated as pieces of meat. The highest form of objectification is what we do to animals. We treat them as if they are not living, breathing organisms who feel pain and pleasure and have moral consideration, but instead as products to be bought and sold. Both are poor forms of ethics, and both are what need to be challenged in terms of ideology. The consequences of these ideologies are all too clear. In terms of capitalism, we are seeing obviously the exploitation of the worker, the perpetuation of slave-like conditions, and ultimately the unhappiness of the general population, not only in terms of material outcomes, but in terms of ideology, in terms of alienation, in terms of how the individual engages and understands their self within their society. People are dissatisfied and unhappy with the way things are working out, even if they are given enough material to meet their needs. In terms of animal agriculture, it only gets worse. How animal agriculture is actually bad goes beyond, I think, any form of exploitation we've ever seen or ever understood to be occurring ever. Let me explain why. So animal agriculture is not only bad for animals, it is bad for humans. Meat production, dairy production, and egg production are contributing to some of the greatest existential crises we've ever seen on this planet. Zoonotic diseases like COVID-19 can rip through our society, crush our economies, and kill masses of our populations, and there is nothing we can do about it, except for stop producing them. The reality is that zoonotic diseases are birthed from having animals in close proximity to humans. If those animals did not exist, then these zoonotic diseases would also not exist. We're actually incredibly lucky with COVID-19. And the reality is that something like H5N1 or H1N1 had a much higher mortality rate than we've ever than COVID-19. Its virulence was simply lower. Its R rate was lower. If it had have reached the levels of transmissibility or virulence in terms of something like COVID-19, or even worse, something like polio, then we would be facing an absolute crisis. Not only would our health services and our economies collapse, but mass panic and death would be gripping our streets. We would be facing another Black Death, another bubonic plague, or something in terms of maybe smallpox, all of which are actually perpetuated by animal agriculture. And if you go back and you have a look after this, and you have a look at the CDC or whatever health authority is in your area, and you look at zoonotic diseases, see how many of them are actually some of the worst diseases that you can think of that we've had to vaccinate against, most of which have come from animal agriculture. The flu, tuberculosis, polio, smallpox, all the result of keeping animals confined in large populations close to humans. Then we have the environmental impacts. The environmental impacts for someone, let's say, that maybe like you and me, maybe relatively low. I mean, I don't mind the idea of Newcastle having a climate that relatively works out like Spain. It doesn't sound all too bad. But for the people that live in the lowlands in Bangladesh, the environmental impacts will be catastrophic. There'll be mass migration, homes destroyed, economies destroyed, and ultimately there will be a humanitarian crisis. Now let's think of it something a little bit more locally. What about crime rates? I don't think many people realize that when they go and buy meat, dairy, and eggs, that they're actually perpetuating high crime rates in their area. Well, that depends on whether they're living in a poor low-income area. Because poor low-income areas are usually where we put slaughterhouses. Slaughterhouses who hire usually the people who are most vulnerable, rather, are directly correlated with violent crime and reports of violent crime, particularly domestic violence. That's because of the psychological damage that slaughtering does to an individual. If you're put in high stress and highly volatile and dangerous environments, and then you are made to kill all day, every day, it has a psychological impact. And one such impact that was noted was the perpetuation of what's called Pitt's disorder. So that's perpetration-induced traumatic stress. It's a form of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder but usually it's considered actually worse. It's when you are the perpetrator of the crime. It can lead to a form of psychological doubling in which the individual cannot live with the actions they are committing. It directly contradicts their inherent values or their current values or understandings of the world. And so they seek to alienate themselves from their actions and so disassociate. This disassociation leads to alcoholism and production of another form of another personality. Somebody who's willing to commit acts of violence and not feel empathy or sorrow towards those creatures. Someone who can genuinely commit an act of violence and take pleasure from it. And this isn't uncommon. These are the reports of slaughterhouse workers themselves who've noted that they've become more violent, who are more capable of committing acts of violence to humans after working in slaughterhouse facilities. And this isn't even considering the fact that these people are so heavily exploited that they are placed into risk of zoonotic diseases, lacerations, which are twice as likely as other equivalent primary industries. And also that they are usually prevented from unionization and will be replaced by the poorest immigrant workers if they do. So even in terms of human exploitation, animal agriculture is awful, but that pales in comparison to animal agriculture's exploitation of animals. With 70 billion animals dying every year unnecessarily, that is the equivalent of about 1,000, I do believe, Holocausts worth of deaths every year. So if we consider that a mass genocide, which I think would be right to do, 6 million people, then how do we equate the 70 billion deaths that are being perpetuated for an industry that is currently accepted? In meat production, we see livestock, 1.5 billion cows being slaughtered for their flesh so people can eat them. In dairy, we see animals not only being slaughtered, just like meat production, because the reality is that there is no such thing as a vegetarian industry, because animals are only profitable so long as they produce milk, and milk is only produced when they are capable of getting pregnant and lactating. And so when an animal is quote unquote spent, it is slaughtered, but that'll be about the age of 5, about a quarter of the way through their lifespan. But the exploitation doesn't stop there. The mother is exploited for the milk after being subject to forced sexual assault in terms of artificial insemination. The calf is then removed, which defies the maternal instincts of many of the cows and the instincts of the calf. The calf is then bolt-gunned in the head if it's a male and killed instantly, killed at birth, so that it cannot drink the milk, or it is taken away so it can't drink the milk if it's a female and raised so that it itself can produce milk. The reality of the situation is the milk is being given to you and not the calf. The milk is being given to a human and not the calf, because if the calf was drinking it, the business would not be profitable. Eggs, people don't really usually consider eggs to be that immoral until they recognize that to produce egg-laying hens, they need to be producing primarily females. When the majority of, there is an equal amount of males and females born by nature. So 50% of those male baby chicks are killed at birth. They are usually thrown into macerators, giant blenders, gassed, or otherwise disposed of. And then the ones that survive are lucky enough to be placed into an environment which is so brutalizing that they will actually cannibalize each other, even though none of them have that natural behavior, because they are placed into confined quarters with over 10,000 other chickens. And this isn't even in a free range facility. And so because of the psychological stress of being placed into such close quarters with so many other chickens, when they can only accommodate 100 chickens in a quote unquote pecking order, they have their beaks removed and are placed into total darkness so that while they lose their minds, they aren't agitated enough to take action and destroy each other to the point in which they are no longer sellable to you, the consumer. And after all of this exploitation, every one of these animals is sent to a slaughterhouse facility in which, if they are lucky enough, they will be electrocuted and then have their throats slit. If they are pregnant, they'll be electrocuted, have their throat slit, and then the child will be beaten to death or have their throat slit as well. And so this is the reality of the kind of exploitation that is perpetuated by only one industry in capitalism. Workers are exploited by the whole system. But this particular market within capitalism is the embodiment of why capitalism is wrong. It is the perpetuation of an inequality against another, to the point in which superiority isn't even a question, to the point in which they aren't even considered another being, an other at all. So why does this happen? I think the reality is it's in the words of Slavoj Žižek, there is a sublime object of ideology. Individuals see the world through a lens, and that lens is their ideology. It is the worldview that is being perpetuated by the constructs which are socio-political in origin. We understand that capitalism is okay, and that an employee-employer relationship is okay, because we are taught that wages are a justified compensation for labor, when there's nothing to instantiate that. We are also told that consumption of animals is okay because we can naturally consume them, because we are omnivorous. Well, the reality cannot be further from the case. Wages are not okay, and the consumption of animals is not okay. So what can we do? The first thing that we need to do to overcome this is take action against ourselves. The first part of revolution is to overcome those ideologies which confine us to the system, which confine us to a form of subjugation, and confine us to a form of subjugation that will make us the oppressors. And this is something that is incredibly common in many Marxist ideologies, the understanding that we ourselves have been hegemonically indoctrinated into a system which turns us into the evil oppressor, just as the Nazi was indoctrinated and turned into the evil oppressor at Auschwitz. We have done it in such more subtle ways that we don't even realize that we are perpetuating a system which condones similar forms of exploitation. So the first port of call is self-reflection, understanding what we do within our society and whether it's ethical or not. The second point is, what power do we have? Because I would agree with Kant and say, ought implies can. So what power do you have to change things? What power do you have within this system? In terms of capitalism, I think it's quite clear. We need to unite and move against this capitalist class's subjugation of the worker. We need to try and put laws forward which actively help and maintain worker rights, but also try to perpetuate a system to move away from this distributionary model. We need to challenge the political domination from a given class, the media's domination perpetuated from that class, and then also we need to challenge the distributionary model itself and perpetuate things like worker cooperatives and have governmental support behind them. In terms of veganism, and how we can overcome animal exploitation, it's far simpler. The reality of the situation is that we do not have to challenge an entire distributionary system, but only one market within the system. Right now, there is a market that is dependent upon the consumer to function. The laws of supply and demand are all too clear. The reality is that market will crumble if we no longer demand these products. The only thing that can prop it up past that is farming subsidies. And that's where vegans must get political, demand the removal of subsidization so that we can directly have our monetary vote respected within this consumerist system. The reality is that within this capitalist system, money is power. And so I think that we have more control over our consumptive habits and the power that we have within the markets than we do within the political sphere of things. But that doesn't mean that we ought not try. We need to unite and we need to challenge these corrupt and damaging ideologies before they destroy not only one life, but billions of lives every year, perpetually, until someone has the courage to do something about it. So I hope you've enjoyed this talk, Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Lewis. It's wonderful. I put an article into the chat just about how I was reading about how communities of color are disproportionately harmed by the effluents from pig farming in North Carolina. And just we actually had a talk a few weeks ago from Gary Francione. You'd obviously be familiar with his work from your philosophy, but he has an epidemiologist friend who says COVID-19 it's just not, like, it's not even a dummy run for sooner or later, like the Spanish flu in 1918. So that came from pig farming. Like HIV came from monkeys. And then now the COVID from the wet markets having the different species all in close proximity. That, yeah, I mean, it might not be in our lifetime, but yeah, I mean, there's every chance, like sooner, or whether it's later rather than sooner, but that this is a dummy run, and that there will be a plague of apocalyptic proportions that is really beyond any of our comprehension. So will we open does anyone want to have their first question? Anything to ask either of our speakers?
And I should say as well, like, it could be about probably anything, like about the discussion at hand, or just maybe in general, just about, what it's like studying for a PhD, like what, like the work someone does as a county councillor, just general questions on anyone have anything?
I did actually want to ask Lewis, in looking for participants for an earlier event, we had this term about how one shouldn't make assumptions about the type of people that vegans are, that they can be oftentimes they're associated, or they're assumed to be kind of left-leaning political, oftentimes female, oftentimes white as well. Yeah. But in looking for, that's a stereotype.
True, it's true. It's very true.
Yeah, well, we had our 3 vegans of color in Jamaica. That's like has a very strong history of veganism, and the Rastafarians as well. Like before it was even a term, like it was in the 1818s. They were a lot of vegans, and they were all black. But I put out a call out on Reddit, and I was mailed by someone who founded a subreddit called Vegans for Trump. So he's I guess his political persuasion, conservative Trumpian, and he would have the view anyway. Like I guess I know your channel a lot. You do talk about how like socialism and veganism are inextricably linked, but I guess like, would you have anything to say to like I suppose me, like I suppose like for my being a vegan, like I just love being able to run past the sheep in the fields and know that I don't pay people to hurt them anymore, and I can imagine kind of being a very high flying, I want to be a teacher after college, not an executive, but I can't imagine if I was just in San Francisco or something, if I was doing very, very well from capitalism, I would not really think that I would just think of being a vegan as just something that I want to do for the animals, and it's an economic system that really, like, would you have anything to say to kind of...
Yeah, I guess I mean, like, you can have the political capitalist vegans. I don't think that's necessarily an issue in terms of within the individual. I think that the people that make those claims usually believe that capitalism is good and have an ethical understanding of the world that perpetuates capitalism as like or usually a necessary evil. Most capitalist apologists are kind of that, that kind of position where capitalism's kind of the best that we can do. And so we reluctantly accept it. That being said, we do not need to have meat, dairy, and egg production, and so argue that we should remove that market from existence through consumerist vote. And I don't think that there is an issue with those individuals. I disagree on the ethics of capitalism, but I certainly would consider them vegans. I would say that if my argument did, and if the Marxist and the left-wing argument did obtain to show that there was an unjustifiable amount of exploitation in relation to the working class, then it would be unvegan, because then obviously the exploitation of sentient beings includes humans. So I would say that. And I think then other people have tried to say that you can marry veganism to anything. And I think that no. I think that there is an ethical purport to these things. So, for example, some people have tried to argue that there are vegan Nazis, for example, or vegan white supremacists. That's an oxymoron. That is a contradiction in the ethical values between those two groups. And so a vegan must be for a certain ethical approach towards humanity. And a vegan capitalist would need to make the argument that capitalism was better towards humans than socialism.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, actually. And I think did we have a raised hand from Marcus?
Yeah. So I suppose my question is for the two of you, actually.
Would you like to go first, or shall I?
Well, can you guys hear me, first of all?
I can hear you. I can hear.
Brilliant, because sometimes it doesn't tell me whether or not I actually have the right thing selected. So it's a question for both of you, actually. And to give a bit of context, Aid, you know this quite well, because 2 years ago, I suppose it was 2 years ago now, we had the beef farmers going on strike because of Mercosur, and we had, this very, very good discussion here, especially down your area, about just transition. And I'm really wondering about the two of you, the sort of your thoughts, but also the importance of a just transition, not only in terms of how it's important environmentally and from an animal welfare point of view, but from a workers' rights point of view, and how, we all know and we all agree that you can't just stop the industry overnight. It would be catastrophic to people as well as everything else. So just your thoughts on those two things.
Shall I go first? And actually, sorry, I don't know how to say your name without messing it up. Is it Adriana? Am I saying it right?
Nobody ever gets it. You're grand if my parents are confused. Adrienne.
Adrienne. Okay, sorry. Would you like to go first, or shall I?
You go on there, Lewis, and I'll jump in after.
Okay, so if just to maybe clarify on those points, if I may, Mark, you were asking essentially, actually, sorry, I have a really bad short-term memory because I've got dyspraxia. Could you please just restate the question? Because
it wasn't a very clear one anyway. Sorry, but
no, it's okay.
Basically, we had as a bit of context, beef farmers went on strike here about 2 years ago at this rate, because of a deal that was going through that would have, the Mercosur deal was going through. And when we were campaigning with them, because, in PvP, we'd be campaigning with them and trying to emancipate them as workers, we had some really good discussions with them about just transition. And it was actually really refreshing to see, because you would think they would be against it, but they're actually very much for it. And a lot of the arguments were getting through. And I suppose I was just looking for both of your thoughts on the importance of a just transition in the intersection between that animal welfare, environmental impact, and workers' rights point of view.
Okay, yeah. So, I mean, obviously, I am sympathetic to the exploitation of those farmers, and I do consider it an issue. That being said, in terms of the profitability of the market, I do want to see that collapse. I want to see their entire industry fall on its head and those jobs be obliterated. People may think that's unsympathetic, but I think that in terms of an unjustified market, that's what we have to allow. The problem is that this system perpetuates no safety net, and that there is nothing there to protect those individuals if that market collapses. And I think that's one of the things that we need to question first of all. And then obviously in terms of the transitional period, I think one of the best things, and it's perpetuated by, for example, campaigners like Earthling Ed, is this idea of making profitable veganism for those farmers, making something about veganism applicable to those farmers, so that their way of life and their market isn't entirely destroyed in relation to obviously us actively trying to prevent those sales. And I think that one of the cool things about this maybe is rewilding, things that incentivize sustainable sustainable changes to the agricultural land. And I think other things to consider are also fruit and fruit, grain, and other productive products, and how much they are. What's the word I'm looking for? What's it? It's like CAP, Common Agricultural Policies in Europe.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
What's it called again? Subsidized. Depending on how much they're subsidized, relation to CAP, I don't think that they are actually subsidized enough for the production of plant products. Most subsidies go massively towards animal products. In terms of plant products, they receive, I think, around 10% of that profits from CAP. And at least this was the British statistics before we left EU, whilst dairy profits were around 60% of that profits from CAP. So I would call for greater subsidization for those farmers who are willing to transition to a vegan mode of production, and I would call for the removal of subsidization for animal agriculture.
Yeah, thanks very much, Mark. Very good question, and kind of well answered there, Lewis. I suppose, so the beef farmers were out on strike here, and we went down to them, we're supporting them, we're campaigning with them a long time, and I really am very conscious of them, because they're good lads who really are in extreme poverty in a lot of ways. I'm conscious of them in every conversation kind of have about animal rights and changing the system. But something I noticed with them as well is that when they were outside blocking the meat factory farms, what they noticed as well was that how the workers were being extremely exploited as well. And we people for profit were really kind of behind attempts to create a kind of broad union of beef farmers and meat factory workers who could actually, damage the industry. And I actually think that's a very important question within veganism. If we want to, suppose, let's say, dismantle the market, dismantle any market, you need the workers with you. If you want to hurt the industry, you need the workers to down tools and stop as well. Because, and I do take your point that you kind of mentioned earlier, Lewis, that, remove the market, right? And this consuming need for meat will collapse that market. But then you're going to have ecological damage done to the habitats of animals. So what animals are safe then? And it kind of opens up that broader question of not just removing the sort of meat industry and the meat market. There's still going to be damage done to animals, because we're going to have to see the expansion of the almond industry or whatever, and they're going to graze over any wild land that's left in America, and whatever buffalo or whatever animals are there are going to be brought to extinction then. So it's not just about factory farmed animals, but animals per se. And then I think then you have to look at the question of bringing down capitalism, and we need to do that collectively with workers and a just transition. And it becomes a question of tactic. Although I kind of not saying, and I totally agree actually, it's subsidizing them for rewilding, for more sustainable ways of farming that doesn't involve the exploitation of animals. 100%, I think that's the key to just transition as well. Retraining workers so that they have the skills. And a lot of beef farmers do not want to be in this business anymore. They are fed up because they're getting screwed left, right, and centre, but they have no way out. So it's very important that we take up, and I think that's the answer to kind of a just transition. But then it becomes a question of tactic. How do we win people over to us? And we need, if we want to challenge the climate change, if we want to challenge the meat industry, we need to bring the small farmers with us. So when we kind of say, obliterate the jobs, although we might want that, to publicly kind of come out and start saying that means they're going to actually not work with you. You're going to have their backup from the onset, instead of bringing them to the table and saying, listen, this fight is our fight and our fight is your fight, and kind of working that way. But I do think that the response will be subsidizing and making sure that there's adequate reskilling for different jobs, whatever. Do you know what I mean? In as kind of Lewis outlined on that.
Yeah, I mean, if I may, I just want to say a couple of things. I actually think I'm glad we agree. I think the reskilling of workers is a brilliant way to take it. And I think that's exactly right. And I think that we do want them on side ideally. And I think even if we look at it, the reality is that unionization is actually heavily costly to industries. So if we're looking to make them unprofitable anyway, just give them a union to deal with. So all those points were great. I guess the only thing I really have in point of contention is the almond industry and the way in which that we will deal with the environmental impacts of a vegan industry. It was shown recently that if we were to switch to a vegan diet, we would actually need to reduce our farming land by 70%. So the reality is that when we look at in the environmental impacts of a vegan diet, even a diverse vegan diet, so including almonds and avocados and so on, it will still be incredibly more sustainable than any other meat, dairy, and egg alternative. Especially when you consider the, and then obviously there's the fish, the ocean side of things. I mean, number one cause of ocean dead zones is animal agriculture. The number one cause of ocean plastics is, again, animal agriculture. Number one cause of deforestation, animal agriculture. And arguably the number one or number two cause of global warming and climate change is animal agriculture. And we haven't even talked about pollution and, groundwater yet, or soil erosion. And so the reality of the situation is, I think that no matter what we do in terms of the environmental impacts of the scenario, as long as we move away from animal agriculture, we will see a benefit to our society and or our climate, or ecology rather.
We come back really quickly, because that is a good point. And actually, I'm sorry, no, I won't. I'll come back. And it does, a huge amount of our kind of farming for crops is even done for crops that will feed the agriculture then. So, you're right in terms of we vastly have a lot more kind of move to play. But then we still have the question of monoculture and how we produce and why. So then that question still stands, and that would still pose a threat and pathogens that Moya. So I agree, it's definitely going to be a lot more sustainable, but will it be the way to stopping climate change on its own without addressing the question of how we produce under capitalism, that type of monoculture and that type of large scale industry done for profit? And I think then you take that question as well, but I take your point, it would be a lot more sustainable if we stop it for animals.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I think that, if we look at monoculture, it is a terrible scenario. I think that the reality is you even have movements within veganism as well, talking about veganic farming, the movement towards permacultural farming, and the movement towards locally grown produce is a really great way of challenging a lot of these issues. And just because something is better doesn't mean it's the best thing to do. I mean, there's always a sliding scale of improvements, and why stop at a half measure when you can go the full 9 yards? And I think that's a great point. So long as if we can do better than the production of monocrops, then we should, and I don't see an issue with that. So yeah.
We've got a question in the chat as well. I'm just looking at, so this is from Callan. What's the best way to go on about individual political activism from a vegan point of view? This actually reminds me of a question or an issue that came up with our Gary Francione event earlier on this year. So he's an abolitionist in the animal rights movement. So put simply, he thinks that welfare reforms in factory farming, or to welfare reforms in animal agriculture, such as bigger cages for the hens, kind of the free range, or kind of the organic or whatever, that they are ultimately counterproductive because they perpetuate the idea that animals can be humanely exploited, and that there is a middle ground between animal exploitation and veganism when there's not, when you can't love the animals and prop up their killing at the same time. So he thinks that they're well intentioned, but they're ultimately counterproductive. And he also has the view that single issue campaigns are ultimately damaging as well, so that we shouldn't, we should stop having our campaigns to end fox hunting or end fur farming. It should just be veganism. It's a very, very simple message. That's, yeah, I mean, and then I suppose there's a lot of disagreement in that in the world of vegan activism, about getting more people on side, or there was a great question from one of our participants that week. She talked about well, who am I? As much as I know bigger cages are not the answer, it should be no cages, but who am I if I was a chicken, if I had 2 weeks of life? I think I would rather a bigger cage than a smaller cage for my 2 weeks of life. I would rather no cage, but who am I to vote against bigger cages? But I suppose I've gone off a bit on track there. I tend to do that. But the best way, so Callan's question, the best way to go about individual political activism from a vegan point of view.
Shall I go? Who first? We need to flip a coin.
You go on. Yeah, you probably have a ledger.
Yeah. So I would say that actually, was it Gary Francone? Did you say that? Yes. Yeah. He sounds like he really knows his stuff. I think that I would agree with him, to be entirely honest with you. I think that what we need to do is perpetuate an ethical consumerism, an understanding of the individual's relationship within the market towards the production the supply and demand anyway. I think that ultimately people have been alienated in a almost Marxian sense from understanding themselves in terms of their consumer vote, and see themselves as rather an aspect of a consumerist economy. And we buy and we buy and we buy, but we don't actually understand why we are buying and what we are trying to fulfill when we do consume. And I think that the reality is that we need to perpetuate something like, as I say, ethical consumerism and veganism, understanding that when you do pay for a product, that you do create the consequences and you yourself are responsible, and that we can't just offload all the ethical burden onto the worker who, does those actions. The farmer or the slaughterhouse worker is not entirely responsible for the market, because a market has consumers just as much as producers. And I think more so when we look at when we are trying to perpetuate something like animal rights, I think that, bigger cages, yeah, it's a nice sentiment. But to me, I find it somewhat insulting in the grand scheme of things. Giving an animal a few extra, centimeters of space so that you can avoid removing the industry seems to me a half measure that needs to be challenged in itself. We don't campaign for half measures because they'll only get quarter measures. And so even if we do try to campaign for a total abolition, we may not achieve it even in a short space of time. But if we try to campaign for a larger goal, then we'll see much greater benefits if we do manage to unite around that goal anyway.
I suppose I'll be quick as well. I suppose to be a vegan, I suppose, is a protest in itself, and it is empowering because it says, my actions do have a change and effect on the world. And often we're told you're just a consumer. It's actually no, I can choose not to do this, and it will damage the market. But I think I'm more for collective action. I think that's the change that is perhaps kind of needed in the world. Like, we're up against a massive industry. It's a very powerful ally to every political establishment across the globe. On top of that, then we've had decades of propaganda from the meat industry, and at the same time then it appears natural and normal and all that. So I think if we want to challenge it, not only do we have our choices as consumers, we have to win that argument by and large with mainstream society, and we're not there yet. Although veganism is definitely a talking point, and like when I was vegetarian 5-6 years ago, it was kind of unheard of, or in my circles anyway. It was definitely an odd thing to be, whereas now it is mainstream and we have the conversation, but not everyone is a vegan. So how do we win the people over to that debate? And I kind of disagree with dropping single issue of campaigns, because that's where you actually pick people up. I might not care about the pig in Alaska, but I care about the mink farm down the road from me. And then if you meet them there and you talk to them about animal rights, and you can bring more people with you and create that argument for a collective force to challenge the industry, target it where it hurts by getting those workers on side, the trade unions, and at the same time, because that's the power within the factory, and if you can take out the powerhouse, do that and bring them to their knees. But also then I suppose kind of as the ideology of pushing back against that ideology.
I have a quick question. If this was the last questions, it's for you, Adrienne, isn't it? That's right, isn't Adrienne? Yeah. Why are you vegetarian, not vegan?
Honestly, I'm just selfish, and you're right, and everything you're saying there, and it's good to have that knowledge. Again, I got lazy, and it's not. I can drop milk. I can drop milk to cheese.
This is the thing. I understand, but do you not think that there's, like, in terms of the exploit, like, so if we look at the exploitation of, let's say, dairy cows, do you not think that that it's like, in terms of then you're causing the suffering and death when you perpetuate that industry? And this is, I would say that even ethical consumerism is a political movement. I think that it's not just one person making one decision. It's us collectively engaged in a marketplace to affect supply and demand on a much greater scale than one purchase. So when you know that you could be part of that movement and that solidarity to eliminate that suffering and that, that death, do you not think that, in the words of, for example, that why veganism is called veganism, which is that it's the beginning and end, the conceptual beginning and end of vegetarianism, that you are obligated to be vegan?
Yeah, I see, you're right. Like, you're right. I know you are, but in my mind, how I justify it is, like, one, it's already a kind of restrictive diet. I love my food. I'm going to miss that. The life is actually hard. It's even harder in a pandemic, but when you're working fucking 8, 12 hours, sometimes you want to just get the little pleasures in life. And I kind of justify it by saying, look, I already am part of a movement of people who are trying to challenge the world, and we're offering solidarity. But like, if maybe as I join the vegan society, you can get in my head a bit more, but that's my logic as it stands. I'd love someone to guilt me into a better position.
I went vegan actually after being vegetarian for years, and it's so much easier than when I started. So I went vegan. It was around the time of that conference, actually. That was what turned me vegan, where, you know, you gave your talk initially. And yeah, I mean, just compare, like, I really struggled at the start. I was hungry all the time, and I suppose I did have to, like, the animals were always on my mind because, you know, because I was finding it so difficult. It was like a constant reminder that I did constantly have to remind myself of why I'm doing it. But now it's just kind of in the background. Like, now I'm really healthy. I was able to, I've done 2 marathons, and I can't wait to do another one when COVID is over, and I'm never sick or anything. And yeah, people say I'm a good advertisement for veganism, and I'm actually reminded, one of my wonderful friends here, Steve, what did he say? Like, he knew me when I was vegetarian and not vegan. And what did he say one time? It's like, oh Moya, like, being vegan is so easy. Like, it's like, if you don't want to, if you disagree in principle with animals being kept in conditions of degradation, to perpetuate this system that brutalizes us and that Western markets have created, the very least you can do is not participate in it. Like, it's not even asking, you don't even have to be an activist or anything. It's just a very, yeah, I mean, it's just very, I suppose I know, but I mean, I guess I was vegetarian for years, knowing that the meat and the dairy industry can't be separated. But I mean, it's very simple on paper. I guess just a lot of us, yeah, a lot of people do love their food though, and that's even, don't tell my mother I said this now, but she's a wonderful human rights activist. But sometimes I do kind of find it hard to see past. Like, she has so much compassion for Rohingya refugees, and so much compassion even for our dog, and will pay for her to be in daycare so she doesn't have to be at home all day, and yet still loves her steak. And I find it kind of hard to see past that. But yeah, I think we're probably gonna have to wrap up there. Nikki, did you say you had I'll ask Nikki, our chairperson, to unmute. Are you there, Nikki?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll stop the recording there. Yeah, thanks everyone for coming. We also have some Just Eat vouchers that we can give out to some people. So they're only €5 ones, but if you want some, just message us or just message me here or on, yeah, just message me here and I'll get you the voucher codes now. And yeah, we'll sort something out with Adrienne and Lewis. Yeah.
Did we have something for Mark as well, and for is it Colin for asking questions? Did we want to do something there? Did Mikey, you say?
Yeah, I think we might give a little bonus one to those two, because I did say that we'd reward people for asking questions.
Yeah. Do you want to send a PM then of your choice of online retailer, and we'll get you a little token of appreciation for your participation?
I was actually gonna say as well, because you were saying you're now being healthy. I was on the juxtaposition, I'm gonna order a vegan pizza after this, and so you can have your little pleasures as well.
No, I've actually got my cheese and onion hunky dory. They're vegan.
I've got that's exactly. That's great. I genuinely think it's cool that you see people think that it's really restrictive, and I think I used to think that, and until I realized there's so much accidentally vegan food, and it's just having the knowledge. Do you know what I mean? Where you realize that it's actually not as bad as it is. I mean, I recently, like, you make mistakes, like, don't get me wrong, but as long as you're trying, like, so for example, I didn't realize Red Bull was tested on animals, and I was drinking Red Bull yesterday. Someone messages, Red Bull's tested on animals. I'm like, oh, sorry, I'm not going to drink that again. But then I'll just go and get another energy drink that I know that's not tested on animals. So it's not like, because of the way that, like, the good thing about markets is that there's usually quite a considerable amount of choices that we can make between them. Even if we can't choose to escape them, like the whole, we're stuck in capitalism, we can usually choose to act between them. And, there are markets that are more ethical than others. So it's pretty cool. Like, so I'm going to get like rather than getting Red Bull, I'll get like Rockstar or something like that, And I think it's these little choices that make, the difference in terms of our consumer power. But I think it's cool.
Well, yeah, great. So that was absolutely fantastic. Thanks very much to both of you for giving up your time to come on here. It was very nice chatting to you.
You too. But no, thanks very much. I really appreciate it. And thanks, Maya, for reaching out. But it was great to look at this topic again, and hopefully it will propel me to get off the cheese.
Yeah, man. Thanks again. I really appreciate the opportunity just to, preach as vegans should,
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
What they say, like, the first rule of Vegan Club is tell everyone about Vegan Club,
There's a famous.
There can be sometimes a temptation. I've actually started online dating recently, and there can be kind of a temptation sometimes to hide with, like you have the meme or whatever, like the how do you know if a girl is vegan? Like, she'll tell you multiple times. But,
No.
yeah, but I suppose, but then I also saw somewhere, but like, if we don't speak up for the animals, there's not really any hope that anyone else will. So
Exactly.
no one, I mean, you might not like to be a preachy vegan, but like, if you're not going to do it.
Speaking of which, if anyone wants to understand the way that discipline operates in our society, and like, for example, those feelings of, when you're abnormal, like that way in which people will, essentially try to correct your behavior, I suggest reading Foucault, Discipline and Punish. Discipline and Punishment, which really outlines the way in which power and really is affecting all of us. I think he says power is everywhere, and I think that's just a great understanding of it. You can't even, like, as you say, like, go online dating and not feel the gaze of the other, trying to force you back into the box of normality. And I think that that's something that we'll actually have to actively combat, which just shows that activism is everywhere.
I just have it in my Tinder profile, like, I dream of one day being the sexiest vegan in my village. It's kind of like, not saying, look at me, I'm vegan, but just kind of, among other things. Like, saying.
I have it on my Twitter, and instead advocating to eat the rich. So, we'll all find our angle. Right, listen, thanks a million, gang. I'm going to head off there, but really appreciate this. Fair play to you, and keep up the great work, all right?
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you, everyone. I'll see you later.
See you.